तो हेलो फ्रेंड्स, आप सभी का स्वागत है। तो आज मैं आप सबको क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल के बारे में बताऊंगा, जो मैंने अपने ब्लॉग में लिख रखा है। तो ये मेरा ब्लॉग है, तो मैंने इस ब्लॉग में अपने ब्लॉग में इसको मैंने सेट करके रख दिया है। तो मैं आपको वीडियो के माध्यम से क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल के बारे में पूरा का पूरा नोट्स में दे रहा हूँ। तो चलते हैं मेरे टैब के स्क्रीन पर। तो क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल ए कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव एनालिसिस। तो इंट्रोडक्शन पार्ट। The Kyoto Protocol stands as a significant milestone in the history of international environment diplomacy. Adopted in 1997 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC), the Kyoto Protocol was the first legally binding international agreement that aimed to reduce greenhouse gases (GHG) emissions and combat global warming, with the Earth's climate under increasing pressure from human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels. The protocol represented a turning point in how international community sought to collectively address climate change. The discussion explores the Kyoto Protocol in detail, including its origins, key principles, mechanisms, challenges, and long-term impacts on climate negotiations. It critically analyzes the treaty's effectiveness legally in the broader context of global environmental governance. Background and origin. The emergence of global climate awareness. The scientific consensus on climate change began forming in 1980s with an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) established in 1988. By the early 1990s, climate science had progressed to the point where it was clear that human-induced emissions of GHGs were causing global warming. Point number 1.2, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The UNFCCC was adopted at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. It aimed to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. However, it did not contain binding emissions reduction targets. Instead, it provided a framework for future protocols, leading to the development of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol overview. Adoption and entry into force. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted on 11 December 1997 in Kyoto, Japan, and entered into force on February 16, 2005, after sufficient ratification by countries. The delay in its implementation was due to the requirement that it be ratified by countries accounting for at least 55% of global emissions. Objectives. The protocol aimed to reduce overall GHG emissions from industrialized countries by an average of 5.2% below 1990 levels. During the commitment period 2008 and 2012, it recognized that developed nations known as Annex 1 countries bore a greater responsibility for climate change due to their historical emissions. Point number 3, structure and mechanisms of the protocol. Point number 3.1, Annexure 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. The protocol distinguishes between Annex 1 countries, mostly industrialized nations and economies in transition, and non-Annex 1 countries, developing nations. Only Annex 1 countries had binding emission targets. Point number 3.2, greenhouse gases covered. The Kyoto Protocol targeted 6 GHGs. Number carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, nitrous oxide, N2O, हाइड्रोफ्लोरोकार्बन्स, HFCs, फिर है परफ्लोरोकार्बन्स, PFCs, एंड सल्फर हेक्साफ्लोराइड, SF. Flexibility and mechanism. Point number 3.3. To help countries to meet their targets in a cost-effective way, the Kyoto Protocol introduced 3 innovative market-based mechanisms. Point 3.31. Emission trading, ET, known as the carbon market. This allowed countries with surplus emission units to sell them to countries exceeding their limits. Point 3.3.2, Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. This allowed developed countries to invest in emission reduction projects in developing countries and receive certified emission reduction CER credits. Point 3.3.3, Joint Implementation, JI. This enabled Annex 1 countries to invest in projects that reduced emissions in other Annex 1 countries and count the reduction towards their own targets. Point 4. Key features and legal framework. Point 4.1, Legally binding commitments. The protocol is distinguished by its legally binding nature. Countries that ratified the treaty committed to emission targets with legal consequences for non-compliance. 4.2, Monitoring and reporting. Annex 1 countries were required to submit annual GHG inventories and reports on progress. These were reviewed by expert review team. Point 4.3, Compliance system. A compliance committee was established to ensure transparency and adherence. It had 2 branches. Facilitative branch provided advice and assistance. Enforcement branch took action against countries not in compliance, including requiring them to make up shortfalls in subsequent periods. Implementation and outcome. Participation. More than 190 countries eventually signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol. However, some key countries did not participate effectively. The United States, the world's largest emitter at the time, signed the protocol but never ratified it, citing concerns over economic impacts and the exclusion of developing countries. Canada withdrew in 2011, arguing that the treaty was ineffective. 5.2, Emission reduction. By 2012, many participating countries had met or exceeded their targets, largely due to transition from coal to gas, collapse of heavy industry in Eastern Europe, use of carbon market and CDM projects. However, critics argued that These reductions were not entirely due to policy effectiveness but often due to structural economic changes, especially in post-Soviet countries. Criticism and challenges. Exclusion of major emitters. The protocol did not impose obligations on major developing countries like China and India, which became large emitters during 2000. This was a major reason cited by the US for not ratifying the treaty. Limited impact on global emission. Despite binding targets for some countries, global emissions continued to rise. They highlighted the protocol's limited coverage and lack of enforcement mechanisms at the global level. Over-reliance on market mechanism. While innovative, the market mechanisms, especially the CDM, face criticism. Projects sometimes exaggerated benefits, concern over hot air credits, excess permits not representing actual reductions, complexity and corruption in implementation, withdrawal and non-compliance. Countries like Canada formally withdrew and others such as Japan, Russia refused to commit to new target under the second commitment period, citing economic and political concerns. The second commit period, Doha Amendment. Adoption. The Doha Amendment was adopted in 2012 at the UN Climate Conference in Qatar. It extended the protocol with second commitment period from 2013 to 2020. Reduced participations. Many key emitters did not commit to the second period. Japan, Russia, New Zealand opted out. The United States remained non-party. Developing countries continued without binding obligations. Limited impact. The amendment lacked the participation of major economies, faced delays in ratification, significantly limiting its effectiveness. Comparison with Paris Agreement. Shift in approach. The Paris Agreement 2015 replaced the Kyoto Protocol as the centerpiece of international climate policy. Unlike Kyoto, Paris adopted bottom-up approach. Voluntary nationally determined contributions NDCs. Inclusion of all countries, developed and developing. Focus on transparency, finance and adoption as well as mitigation. Lessons learned. The Kyoto Protocol rigid and top-down architecture with its sharp divide between developed and developing nations showed limitations. The Paris Agreement learned from this and adopted a more inclusive and flexible structure. Achievements and legacy. Despite its flaws, the Kyoto Protocol achieved several important things. First, binding treaty on climate. It was the first countries agreed to legally binding targets to limit emissions, marking fundamental shift in global climate governance. Institutional innovations. Kyoto introduced market mechanisms for carbon trading, detailed compliance and reporting procedures, capacity building efforts in developing nations. Raised global awareness. The Kyoto Protocol elevated climate change as central issues in global diplomacy, economics and development, paved way for future agreements. Although replaced by the Paris Agreement, Kyoto laid the groundwork for international cooperation on climate, highlighting the importance and difficulty of global environmental treaties. Conclusion part and last part. The Kyoto Protocol was landmark in international treaty that represented both the ambitions and limitations of early climate action. It established the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities CBDR, introduced innovative market mechanisms and pushed nations to acknowledge their role in environmental degradation. However, its rigid division between developed and developing countries, lack of universal participation, and over-reliance on market-based solutions ultimately constrained its effectiveness. Till Kyoto contributions to international law, environmental diplomacy, and climate science cannot be overlooked. As the world continues to grapple with challenge of climate change, the Kyoto Protocol remains a powerful symbol of the early attempt to unite the global community around a common goal. Its legacy lives on in the frameworks that followed, including the Paris Agreement, and in the continuing efforts to secure a sustainable future for all.